Do you believe that time erases everything? What if I told you that some love stories not only resist time, but become even stronger when everything seems lost? Well, yes. This story is living proof that the past is never really buried. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right moment to reappear. And when it does, oh my friend, prepare your heart. Emily and Jack lived a movie romance during their youth. The kind of pure, visceral love that leaves a good scar. But out of nowhere, everything was interrupted. Letters that disappeared, an inexplicable silence, and the emptiness of a future that was torn away before it could begin. Decades passed. Each one went on with their lives, with ups and downs, achievements and emptiness, until a click, yes, a click on a forgotten social network, rekindled everything. But here comes the problem. What should have been just an emotional reunion ended up revealing secrets that had been hidden for 30 years, and that had enough power to destroy everything again. You will now get to know a true, intense, and deeply human story. A story about forgiveness, reconciliation, family secrets, and about the kind of affection that neither time, nor distance, nor silence can erase. Get ready to be moved, reflect, and who knows, find little pieces of your own story between the lines. Because love, when it is true, never ages, it matures. But before you allow yourself to feel that, are you ready to find out what the real problem was in their reunion? In that small town in the interior of Texas, where mornings began with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and neighbors still greeted each other with a sincere wave from the porch, two hearts began to beat in unison. Emily, the daughter of a retired teacher and a watchmaker with a serene soul, was the kind of young woman who carried in her eyes the sweetness of wildflowers. Jack, on the other hand, was a soft-spoken boy, but with a restless spirit. His smile bore the mystery of stories that had yet to be told. They met in one of those narrow hallways of the local school, where time seemed to slow down, and where each glance they shared carried a world of possibilities. It was there, among borrowed books and embarrassed smiles, that a young love began, filled with affection, kindness, trust, and that dose of insecurity that only first loves know. The world was small, but their feelings were too big to fit into the limitations of that time. And there was a magic in the air, the kind that makes even fear seem like poetry. Sometimes when they talked about the future, they imagined a house with a porch, children running around barefoot, and the sound of an old radio playing Elvis Presley in the background. But life, with its merciless habit of testing us, silently set the stage for the breakup. In the week leading up to the long-awaited prom in 1977, Emily hand-sewed her own dress, while Jack saved every penny from his work at his father's workshop to buy a red rose, the one he dreamed of pinning to her wrist. There was hope in every gesture, in every plan, in every glance exchanged under the starry sky of the Texan nights. Back then, love seemed simpler, and at the same time, more absolute. There were no cell phones or social networks, but the words, spoken, had a weight that has almost been lost today. They talked about dreams like someone planting seeds for a tree that will take years to grow, with faith, courage, and a rare kind of understanding that only those who truly love know. But in the blink of an eye, everything went wrong. Jack received some abrupt news. His family would have to move immediately to another state because of a serious problem with his sick grandfather. The news came like a bolt of lightning in the middle of the afternoon, without warning, without the right to say goodbye, without time to say, "Wait for me." Emily went to the prom, alone, wearing a light blue dress and a broken heart. And even though she smiled in the photos with her friends, she kept inside her a pain that only years would be able to translate. What no one saw that night, amidst the silver balloons, the toasts with soda, and the songs by Donna Summer, was the silent tear that ran down Emily's face when the couple's favorite song started playing. It was "I Honestly Love You" by Olivia Newton-John. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying not to fall apart right there and then. But inside her, something was breaking. It wasn't just Jack's absence. It was the feeling of abandonment, the fear of loneliness, the breaking of trust. Deep down, she carried the feeling of having experienced something too deep to be ignored and too brief to be forgotten. It was as if time had pressed the pause button right at the height of the song, and even surrounded by people, she felt alone. Loneliness there was not the absence of company, but the absence of meaning, and so a silent scar was born inside her, marked by a bittersweet mixture of compassion and resilience. She didn't know it, but Jack was also crying that night, on the other side of the country, with his chest tight and a handful of words stuck in his throat. And it was there in that rupture that destiny began to write a much bigger story, one of those in which the power of kindness, forgiveness, and sincerity would still play a prominent role. The days that followed Jack's departure were enveloped in a dense, almost palpable silence. Emily, who had always found refuge in writing, began to fill notebooks with words she dared not say out loud. Long letters, full of love, hope, trust, and a hint of despair crossed her hands night after night. Each one began the same way. "Dear Jack, today I thought of you once again." They were raw statements of disconcerting sincerity, written with tears that stained the paper and turned ink into emotion. She told him about her school days, how she missed his laughter, and even the times they fought over silly jealousy. She spoke of the dress he never saw, of the emptiness that remained in her heart, and of her faith, almost childish, that one day he would return. With an almost painful kindness, she folded each letter lovingly and took it to the post office. The attendant already recognized her but said nothing, just received the envelopes and put them in the basket, as if they were requests to the universe. Time passed. The letters never returned, but they were never answered either, and that hurt. As much as she tried to remain calm, Emily began to harbor doubts that silently gnawed at her soul. Had Jack simply chosen to forget her? Had her sweetness been in vain? The lack of an answer weighed more heavily than the separation itself. As the months passed, understanding gave way to insecurity. It was as if each silence from him said, "Move on, it's over." But she couldn't. She still believed in the strength of what they had lived. She still dreamed of reconciliation, still imagined his eyes meeting hers at some corner of destiny. There was a kind of poetic madness in it, an out-of-date romanticism, driven by the wisdom of the heart, the kind that ignores logic and trusts only in what it feels. Even when her friends told her to let it go, Emily couldn't. Something whispered inside her, "Jack wouldn't do that to you." And then, on one of those days when silence weighs as much as time, she stopped writing. Not because she stopped feeling, but because she felt too much. The words no longer fit on the paper, and absence, as painful as it was, had become a constant presence in her life. Decades later, when the world seemed different and cell phones had replaced love letters, Emily lived a quiet routine in her house in California. While cleaning out the attic, she found an old wooden box. Inside were all the letters, the ones she had written, and the ones she had never had the courage to send. It was like opening a wound that never really healed. But destiny, which loves to surprise us when we least expect it, had something unimaginable in store. While visiting an old school friend, Emily heard, almost by accident, a sentence that froze her heart. "Jack once told me he wrote you dozens of letters, but never got a reply." For a few seconds, the world stopped. A chill ran down her spine. What did that mean? Did he write too? What had happened? And it was there, between the shock and the emotion, that a truth began to emerge. Perhaps someone, or something, had interrupted that exchange of words, that invisible thread of affection, compassion, and honesty that still united them. Suddenly the past seemed less clear and much more intriguing. Something was driving her, like a silent call to look deeper, and when the soul begins to seek answers, there is no one who can stop it. As the years went by silently, Emily transformed her pain into purpose. She decided to study literature, immersing herself in words as if seeking shelter. She became a teacher at a public school in California, where the classroom became a stage for her compassion, empathy, and kindness to flourish. She taught her students with the kind of patience that only those who have faced true loneliness know. She spoke about literature with passion, recommended Dom Casmurro to reflect on trust, and drew parallels between The Little Prince and the power of kindness. Her life was calm, predictable, filled with books, plants, and silence. But there was an absence that never ceased, a kind of delicate shadow that lay beside her every night. Emily tried to move on, yes, but her heart kept a reserved space, where Jack's face still smiled as if the years had not passed. There was love, there was memory, and there was a lump in her throat that she simply learned to carry. Sometimes, when I looked out the window on rainy days, I wondered what he was doing, where he was living, if he was thinking about her too. On the other side of the country, Jack was following a different path, but one equally marked by absence. After moving abruptly, he immersed himself in the family business and proved himself to be a talented but introspective businessman. He was respected, admired, but little understood. His colleagues saw him as a man of firm decisions, but some noticed that absent sparkle in his eyes. He never married. He had relationships, of course, but none lasted long enough to fill the void left by Emily. Her absence was like background music that never stopped playing, soft, constant, but impossible to ignore. Jack wondered on silent nights at the office what would have been if that letter had arrived. He carried within him the guilt, the doubt, and the strange certainty that something had been interrupted by other people's hands. He never stopped writing even after years. He kept the letters in a wooden box, the same one where he had once placed a small photograph of the two of them at the winter ball. He spoke little about the past, but he lived within it. And there, among contracts, meetings, and figures, there was a man who still believed in the possibility of reconciliation. He just didn't know how to start. It's curious how time seems to heal, but sometimes it only numbs certain pains. Emily and Jack followed parallel lives, like two trains on different tracks, always heading in the same direction, but never crossing paths. Both cultivated an appearance of stability, but inside they were like old houses, beautiful on the outside but full of echoes, cracks, and memories that insisted on reappearing. There was wisdom in their routines, resilience in their choices, and humility in the silence with which they accepted life's designs. But the absence, oh, that absence. It walked with them, sat at the table, accompanied their birthdays, Christmases, ordinary days. In every small victory, there was the shadow of what if. And even without knowing it, they both carried the same hidden desire, to meet again. Not just with each other, but with the version of themselves that existed when they were together. That lighter, more hopeful, more alive version. And it is when the soul begins to call out for something that seems to have been lost, that the universe begins to weave the threads of destiny in surprising ways. It was a normal Saturday afternoon, the kind of afternoon when time seems to move more slowly. Emily was organizing some old papers in her office when she decided, almost on impulse, to check out the Facebook group for high school alumni, a page she rarely visited. There, among nostalgic posts, faded photos, and warm comments, her gaze stopped on a black and white image, the class photo of 1977. And there he was, Jack, young, smiling, with that look that still haunted her dreams. A shiver ran down her spine. Her heart, unaccustomed to that kind of emotion, accelerated. Something inside her stirred with an unsettling mix of fear, hope, and courage. For a moment, she thought about ignoring it, closing the browser, and returning to her safe routine. But curiosity, the legitimate daughter of nostalgia, spoke louder. She clicked on the photo, then on a name, then on a profile. And there, among the few public posts, she found a piece of information that made her hands tremble. Jack was alive, single, and lived just a few hours away. Emily was paralyzed for minutes. It was as if all the letters that had never been delivered, all the words that had been stifled, and all the feelings that had been kept back rose up all at once in an internal whirlwind. Why now? Why was she, who had learned to live with silence, being pulled back to the past? It was as if the universe was saying, "You are ready." But there were so many doubts, so much unresolved pain. Still, she kept going. She looked for more information. She searched through social networks, profiles of acquaintances, photographs in old posts, not like a spy, but like a soul in search of meaning. And each new discovery was accompanied by an intense emotion. Gratitude that he was well, sadness for everything they had not experienced, and a hint of inspiration that there was still time, Emily began to imagine what it would be like to see him again. Would he remember her with the same affection? Would he have changed much? Was there still love? And then, between one thought and another, she decided she needed to do something. She could no longer ignore the call of her own story. In the following weeks, Emily prepared herself as if she were preparing for a journey. She watched videos about reunions, read texts about forgiveness and reconciliation, and immersed herself in deep reflections about her own life. It was as if she were reconnecting with herself. She wrote a simple but sincere message. "Hi Jack, it's me. I found an old photo and thought of you." It took her 3 days to hit the send button. 3 days of anxiety, insomnia, and imaginary conversations with the mirror. But when she finally sent it, she felt an indescribable relief. And then, like in a well-scripted movie, the reply came the next day. Short, direct, but full of compassion. "Emily, you don't know how long I've been waiting for this." It was then that hope took shape. That time stopped being a villain. That the courage of a click rekindled a love that had never been extinguished. And in her heart, a new chapter began to be written, with more maturity, more humanity, and, above all, with a truth that not even time dared to erase. The sun was still rising when Emily took the road towards Arizona. It was a silent, almost complicit morning, as if the world knew the importance of that moment. The coffee shop chosen by Jack was simple, on the side of a little-traveled highway, with a faded red awning and the constant aroma of strong coffee and toasted bread. Emily arrived ahead of schedule. She was nervous, of course, but there was a serenity there that had been gained over the years, with maturity, with resilience. She sat near the window, from where she could see the cars coming along the road. Each headlight in the distance made her heart race. And then finally he appeared. Jack. Grey hair, a shy smile, but the same look. The one that mixed affection, respect, and a rare kind of sincerity that can be recognized from afar. When their eyes met, there was no need to say much. A long, silent, awkward hug, and full of compassion. It was as if time had stopped just for them. The words came later, little by little, with pauses and sighs. The conversation began with simple questions. "Are you okay? Where have you been living? Do you remember that algebra teacher?" But soon the sentences gained density. Emily spoke of her life as a teacher, of the loneliness of some Christmases, of the constant emptiness of an unfinished love. Jack told her about his career as a businessman, of the difficulty of trusting new people, of the fear of appearing weak. And between sips of coffee, the two allowed themselves to laugh. A shy, somewhat restrained laugh, but full of gratitude for being there. At certain moments, they would fall silent, just looking at each other, as if trying to rediscover in each other's faces those teenagers from 1977. It was beautiful, it was real, it was human. But there was something strange in the air. Jack seemed to hesitate at certain points in the conversation. Sometimes he would look away. Sometimes he would change the subject. Emily noticed. She had always been sensitive to other people's silences. And although she felt that dormant love awakening within her, she knew there was something he hadn't said yet, something important. And it was this silence that hung over the table until the last sip of coffee. When they said goodbye, he hugged her tightly, as if holding something precious that he was afraid of losing again. And then he said, "There's something I need to tell you, but not here. Can we walk a little tomorrow?" Emily nodded. There was something in her voice that mixed fragility and regret. She knew that the reunion was just the beginning of a new journey, a delicate crossing between the past and the present. And that night, as she lay down in the simple hotel where she had stayed, Emily felt her heart full and at the same time restless. There was emotion, there was hope, but also an echo of insecurity deep in her soul. What was Jack hiding? What could be so serious that it could be postponed even after so much time? But she trusted, not only in him, but in life. Because those who carry within themselves the wisdom of love and the power of kindness know that the truth, no matter how painful it may be, is the only path to reconciliation. And there, amidst memories and omens, something whispered in her chest. Prepare yourself, Emily. Tomorrow, you will discover the weight of a secret kept for decades. The Arizona sun was beginning to rise when Emily and Jack decided to walk along a quiet trail on the outskirts of town. The silence between them was different from the comfortable stillness of yesterday. There was an air of anticipation, as if time were holding its breath. Jack walked slowly, his eyes on the ground, as if he were searching for courage with each step. Emily, in turn, walked alongside him with her heart racing but calm. She knew she was going to hear something important. She couldn't imagine what, but she could feel in the air that it was something that would change everything. They stopped on a rustic wooden bench in the shade of an ancient oak tree, and it was there that Jack began to speak. His voice faltered, at first, but soon found the firmness that only honesty can provide. Emily, shortly after we broke up, I met someone. It was fast, confusing, and before I understood what was happening, she was pregnant. Emily froze. The words echoed inside her as if they were breaking through a dam of accumulated silence. Jack continued, I have a son. He's almost 30 now. And I've never told anyone who his mother was. Emily didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze steady, her eyes moist but attentive. It wasn't just the content of what he was saying, but the emotional weight with which each word came to the surface. Jack explained that, at the time, he felt lost, hurt, resentful. He sought comfort wherever he could, and in that tangle of unresolved emotions, he made choices that not even he fully understood. I made a mistake, Emily. I made a mistake out of weakness, out of fear, out of loneliness, and I've carried that guilt ever since. She listened, not with judgment but with understanding. Time had taught her that human beings are complex, fragile, and that life sometimes pushes us to make decisions that only maturity could avoid. There was, in that moment, a rare opportunity for genuine empathy, the kind that comes from a deep look between two souls who respect each other. Emily took a deep breath. She felt love for him. She felt the weight of 3 decades of silence and the impact of a truth that, although painful, was liberating. And do you still talk to that woman? She asked, already sensing that there was more to that story than he had revealed so far. Jack lowered his eyes. He ran a hand through his hair and paused for a long time. No, I don't. The last time I saw her was almost 30 years ago. Things ended badly, but at the time I thought it best to keep my distance. For the child, for her own good, out of cowardice too, perhaps. There was regret in his voice, but there was also something unsaid. Emily sensed it, and with the delicacy of someone who understands silences, she didn't press. The wind blew lightly through the leaves, as if the world itself was waiting for that truth to emerge fully. And then, in Jack's eyes, a different light appeared. That light somewhere between guilt and courage. He wasn't done yet. Emily knew. She just didn't imagine that what would come next would forever change not only their story, but also the family ties she thought were lost. It was as if the universe was saying, now that the secret has been revealed, get ready. The real story is yet to come. And Emily, even though she was afraid, chose to stay. Because where there is love, there is room for forgiveness. And where there is truth, there is a path to reconciliation. Late that afternoon, Jack invited Emily to see his house, a simple and welcoming place on the outskirts of the city. The living room had the air of a home that had been lived in, shelves filled with old books, black and white photographs, objects that smelled of memories. Emily walked slowly, as if she were walking through a museum of the soul, until her eyes fell on a discreet photo frame on top of an old dresser. The image showed a younger Jack next to a smiling woman with familiar features, too familiar. Emily approached with a chill down her spine. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her heart began to beat wildly. That woman, it couldn't be, but it was. The frame held a forgotten image from the past, her younger sister, Clara, the same one she hadn't spoken to in over 20 years since a bitter and hurtful fight, the same one who disappeared without explanation. The ground seemed to disappear. beneath her feet. Emily stood still, holding the photo in her hands, as if holding her own history crumbling. Jack, who had been watching from afar until then, realized the impact. He walked over to her and with a trembling voice confirmed what she had already guessed. Yes, it's her, Clara. She was the mother of my child. The world spun. Emily felt as if she had been struck twice, once by fate's betrayal, and once by the belated discovery that her sister was part of the web that separated their paths. That old knot, never undone, was reappearing with force. The sister with Sauis, whom she had shared childhood secrets, with whom she had laughed, cried, dreamed, had walked away without explanation, and now the reason lay before her in a dusty photograph. The pain was deep, but it wasn't just pain. It was indignation, it was sadness, it was the wound of broken trust. And in the midst of it all, a question echoed like thunder. Why had Clara never said anything? Why had she hidden something so crucial, so impactful, so human? Emily took a deep breath. She tried to process it, but the emotions came like waves. Hurt affection, frustrated compassion, love confused with abandonment. Jack just lowered his head. There was more to come, she knew, and none of it would be easy to digest. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The silence was thick, sharp, loaded with memories and assumptions. Emily sat down slowly on the couch, still holding the photo in her hands. There was an ancestral pain there, which was not limited to Jack or Clara, but to the loss of innocence, blind trust, the simplicity of family affection. That image opened a vortex in time, pulling up forgotten memories, like the day Clara cried in the backyard without explaining why, or the last argument before her departure. Now everything makes sense, Emily murmured, more to herself than to Jack. But it was a feeling that did not heal, at least not immediately. It was necessary to invoke wisdom to understand that the past, however hard it may be, is only raw material for the present. It was necessary to summon courage to not run away. And more than anything, it was necessary to embrace forgiveness, not as a relief to the other, but as a liberation from herself. Emily knew that the next step would be even harder, because what hurt now was no longer Jack's silence, but Clara's silence, and that, perhaps, would be the hardest to break. In the days that followed the revelation, Emily was overcome by a whirlwind of thoughts. The reunion with Jack had already shaken the delicate emotional balance that she had maintained with so much effort. But discovering that her sister, Clara, had been behind one of the most confusing and painful chapters of her life brought forth an avalanche of buried memories. During long, sleepless nights, she relived moments from her childhood, seemingly banal scenes that now took on new meanings. She remembered the night she found Clara crying in her room, the enigmatic note she had left before leaving, and her strange reluctance to talk about relationships at that time. Little by little, the pieces began to fit together. Jack, for his part, showed himself to be more vulnerable than ever. He shared with Emily details of his brief, intense, and turbulent relationship with Clara. He said that everything happened in the interval between the disappearance of the letters and his frustrated attempt to move on. It was a mistake, but never out of malice, he confessed. Emily, torn between anger and compassion, began to understand the true extent of the story that had been omitted. There was a particularly difficult moment. Emily received a letter sent anonymously, containing old photos and a copy of a note that Clara had written and kept, but never delivered. The content of the letter was deeply moving. Clara revealed that she had always felt in her sister's shadow, admiring her strength, her sweetness, her ability to love without reservations. She said that her involvement with Jack was not planned, but rather the result of need, loneliness, and the feeling of never being seen completely. She said that she tried to distance herself, that she never wanted to cause pain, but that in the end, she lost control of the situation. I distanced myself because I loved you too much to face your pain, and because my shame was greater than my courage. Reading it was devastating. Emily cried like she hadn't cried in years, but deep down she began to understand. Not to justify it, not yet, but to accept that sometimes even our deepest bonds can become entangled. That humanity is made of flaws, of stumbles, of decisions made amidst tears and silence. That forgiveness is not born ready-made, but is cultivated through pain and time. And so, a new layer of the story was revealed. Jack's son, who until then had been just a distant memory, now had a name, a face, a story. Emily felt strangely connected to him. After all, he was her nephew, blood of her blood. And at the same time, the link to a painful truth. She began to consider the possibility of meeting him, of introducing herself not only as his mother's sister, but as someone willing to reclaim the bonds lost through time and fear. It was a risky move, but one full of hope, altruism, and humility. Emily now understood that her life had been shaped not only by the choices she had made, but also by the choices of others, and that everyone at some point carries a hidden past, waiting to be illuminated by love, empathy, understanding. And the more she delved into this story, the more she realized that behind every pain there was also a chance for healing. What had previously been just a loving reunion now became a process of family reconciliation, complex, painful, but deeply necessary. Emily spent hours looking out the window, without really seeing what was outside. It was as if the outside world was suspended, while her interior was fighting a silent battle between reason and feeling. There was a mixture of confidence and insecurity within her, of gratitude for the reunion and fear of losing herself again. The dilemma was brutal. Start over with Jack, rebuild bridges, rekindle the love that never faded, or leave everything as it was, accept the past as the past, and move on with life as it had been shaped. But how could she ignore what she felt? How could she pretend that that reunion hadn't shaken every fiber of her being? She was no longer the young woman in the blue dress from 1977, but she was also no longer the woman who learned to survive. Without answers, she was someone else. A renewed version of herself touched by the wisdom of time, by the compassion of discoveries, and by the possibility of reconciliation with herself, with her sister, with love. Jack was also struggling with his shadows. He knew he couldn't ask for anything, that perhaps he had lost the right to even hope. But even so, he hoped. Emily's presence by his side had rekindled something inside him that had been dormant. For a long time, inspiration. And he no longer wanted to live with half-truths. He was willing to offer everything he was, with his flaws, with his history, with his humanity. "I don't know what it will be like, but I know I want to try," he had told her one calm night in a low voice, as if he were saying a prayer. Emily listened in silence. That stirred everything. With the pain of absence, with the resentment that had been kept, with the love that was still pulsating, but also with the memory of everything that had been lost. And even with the tenderness in Jack's eyes, she wondered, what if, by trying to start over, she opened even more wounds? What if she couldn't forgive completely? What if his presence, instead of healing, brought back memories that hurt? It was the kind of dilemma that cannot be resolved with logic. It is the heart that needs to answer. And it was at this crossroads that Emily realized that perhaps the real issue was not about Jack, nor about Clara, but about herself, about the woman she had become, about the ability to choose love despite fear, to make room for affection even after disappointment, and to believe that the power of kindness can still transform stories, even those that seemed doomed to silence. She understood that she did not need to have all the answers, that she could go slowly, that she could start, over little by little, with care, with kindness, with the courage of someone who has seen rock bottom and even so decided to flourish. The past did not need to be forgotten, but it could be resignified. And in that pause between what was and what would come, Emily let the wind touch her face, because sometimes all we need is a breath of hope to take the first step. And what would come next? Well, time, with its eternal patience, would show. 40 years after that night when Emily danced alone with a fake smile on her face and her heart in pieces, the gymnasium of the old school was reopened for a reunion of former students. The lights were different, the faces marked by time, but The feeling in the air was the same, that subtle desire to rediscover who we were, to look back with empathy, and to recognize ourselves with more understanding. Emily arrived with slow but firm steps, her blue dress now adapted to her time, but still with the same delicate touch of youth. As she entered the hall, a wave of memories enveloped her. The songs of that time, the aged posters, the faces that were once part of her teenage world. Jack was waiting for her near the stage. He was wearing a simple suit, but his gaze had the same tenderness of decades ago, now tempered by the wisdom acquired through mistakes, losses, and rediscoveries. When their eyes met, there was no need to say anything. He held out his hand and she took it. It was time to dance. The music began softly. At Last by Etta James filled the room with a nostalgic and almost sacred tone. Emily rested her head on Jack's shoulder. The two moved slowly, as if honoring time, as if dancing with all the versions of themselves. There was love there, but there was also forgiveness. Forgiveness for the letters never received, for the wrong decisions, for the prolonged silences. There was gratitude for having met again, not to relive the past, but to create something new with more truth, more humility, and less haste. The former colleagues watched in silence, some smiling, others discreetly wiping away tears. It was impossible not to be moved. That dance was not just a romantic reunion. It was a celebration of the courage of those who allowed themselves to start over, of the compassion of those who chose to look at the pain of others and say, "I understand," and the hope of those who, even after everything, still believe in the power of kindness as a bridge to healing. It was a reminder, time may separate, but true love finds ways. At the end of the song, the dance floor filled with other couples. They laughed, exchanged stories, some tried forgotten steps, others simply hugged. Emily and Jack, still holding hands, moved a little away from the center. They sat on one of the gym benches side by side in silence. What they felt was difficult to describe, but easy to feel, a gentle peace, made of reconciliation with the past and inspiration for the future. Emily thought of Clara, of the nephew she might meet soon, of the new chance to rebuild the bonds of affection that had once been broken. Jack, in turn, looked at her as if he were seeing an everyday miracle, simple but transformative. They didn't know what would come next, but they knew they would be together, this time with more honesty, more humanity, and less fear. The 1977 ball had left its mark, but this one sealed a story of resilience, selflessness, and mature love, the kind that blossoms not in spite of the scars, but because of them. And now tell me, after all this, what would you do in Emily's place? Would you have the courage to forgive, to give love another chance, even after so many wounds? Or would you prefer to keep your feelings in a box and let time, once again, silence everything? This story is not just about reunion. It is about the courage to start over, about the beauty of true understanding, about the power of forgiveness that frees, not the other, but yourself. And more than that, it is an invitation for you to look inside at your silences, at your broken bonds, at the feelings that you let go dormant. Maybe it is time to write a letter that was never sent, or who knows, to dance with someone again, even if it is with memories. Love is still possible, even after decades, and the biggest problem many times is not in others, but in what we have not yet had the courage to face. So tell me in the comments, do you believe in second chances? Which part of this story touched you the most? What feelings did it awaken inside you? And of course, if you want to continue learning about real stories that transform, inspire life, and touch the soul, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come walk with me on more journeys like this. Because in the end, we all just want this, to belong, to love, and to be loved in return.